Greetings and salutations. In this video, I would like to comment on a hot topic, which is the ability to run Windows computers and have desktop Linux native applications running right alongside your Windows applications. Before we get into this, a couple of things I would like to point out. First of all, we are not talking about running a virtual machine on a Windows computer. That would involve downloading some sort of virtualization software like VirtualBox or VMware and installing an entire Linux operating system in a virtual machine that would run on your Windows machine. That's not what we're talking about. We've been able to do that for years. What this video refers to is the Windows subsystem for Linux, which has been in development now for 3 years. And we are now getting to a stage where you can sit down in front of a Windows machine and launch Linux native applications right next to your Windows applications. It treats Linux as a runtime environment, just like Java or Bash or Python. If you don't quite understand what I'm talking about when I say runtime environment, you don't have to, but that's essentially what the Windows subsystem for Linux does. It allows Windows to run Linux applications. I'd also like to point out that the big corporations, Microsoft, IBM, Google, that are currently embracing Linux and doing all kinds of interesting things with it, cannot take Linux away from us. I hear that all the time. I hear people say, Microsoft will take Linux away from us. They can't. There's no way. Linux is a free and open concept, which is not owned by any corporation. Its openness means that there will always be the ability to compile and run any software that is created for Linux or the Linux kernel itself. It certainly is a lot more convenient to download a distribution like Ubuntu or Manjaro or Linux Mint or whatever, and have all of that done for you in advance. Plus, you get a nifty package manager, which means that you can go grab Linux software that's pre-compiled and ready to go on your system. But it's not necessary. So they can't take Linux away from us. But what they can do is they can create their own environment, including Linux, that makes it so that a large group of users become dependent upon this environment that they create in order to use Linux applications. And what that would do is it would push aside those of us who use Linux natively, who install Linux distributions on bare metal hardware and do not use their product, whether that be Microsoft or Google or IBM, or whoever it is. So let's get into why that is, and why that's something that we need to be concerned about as we watch these developments. Let's talk a little bit about the Windows subsystem for Linux and what it is. So the way it works is that you open up your Windows 10 machine and you install the WSL here. You update it to the latest version. And then you choose a distribution of Linux that you would like to install on your machine. That could be Ubuntu, that could be Kali Linux. We've got Debian. I'm not sure how many are available. And once you do that, you will now have access to a terminal that looks and feels and works a great deal like Linux. And as of this year, we're now talking about being able to integrate Linux desktops with the Windows desktop. So you can have keyboard shortcuts and Linux applications that are running about as close to natively as you can get. It just happens to be running alongside of Windows applications. From a completely nerdy point of view, that's actually kind of cool if you stop and think about it. Wow, we've integrated these two systems and you can have the best of both worlds. And let's say that for some reason I have to be on Windows and now I can bring in these Linux tools and whatever's the best one, great, right? Why do you think Microsoft would do this? I mean, stop and think about that for a minute. A corporation is an entity that exists for one purpose, and one purpose only, and that is to make a profit. That is the only reason that corporations exist. Regardless of what the public relations people and the spokespeople and the spin doctors tell you, a corporation does not go after any endeavor without seeing a way to make money out of it. Linux is free. I can download Linux and use it on my system, and I never have to pay a dime for it. I don't even have to tell anybody who I am. Why would Microsoft give a damn? Well, because Microsoft is a lone wolf in the technology world. The entire rest of the computer world is working with Unix or Linux. So they're Unix-like operating systems. Linux is nothing more than a Unix-like operating system. And Microsoft, with the NT kernel, is different. And they sit on a mountain of proprietary code. And what has happened in the last 5 years or so is that more and more enterprise-level computer people have shrunk away from the Windows reality, and they would rather run open source solutions. Microsoft has a great big business in the cloud space world with something called Azure. This is like virtual server environments that you can buy from them as a business. You don't need to actually have physical servers. You can have these virtual servers. And so this is why we have the Azure Sphere OS and all this stuff that you hear about. And that's where they're making their money these days. They stopped making money on Windows years ago. They don't really want to even deal with Windows. They got rid of a dedicated Windows development team a few years ago and put it under the Microsoft Office development team. That's how much they care about Windows. That's why we had that period of time where we had these awful updates that came down that destroyed half your system or took your files away. It's because basically they put the kids in charge and got rid of all the adults who were actually programming Windows. So what I think they're seeing here is the ability to embrace Linux. And yes, we are going to get into embrace, extend, and extinguish here, and integrate it in with the system. And of course, on the surface, we're hearing all this. Windows loves Linux, and we love open source. And look, we're going to open source a bunch of old Windows code that doesn't even matter these days. See, we're opening things up. We're going to be more transparent. Right. I don't trust them. I'm not one of those people who wears a tinfoil hat and goes around and says, "Oh, all corporate entities are evil and they will eat you alive." I think if you are going to live in the real world, you're going to have to use this technology at some point. But what Microsoft is doing is very insidious in that they are creating this environment in which they're going to make it really easy for those people out there who are Linux curious. They don't understand a lot about Linux, but they would like to start using the nice Linux applications they've heard of to be able to do that very painlessly. So these people will not have to learn how to install Linux. They will not have to learn how to maintain a Linux system. They really won't have to learn how the package manager works on their particular distribution. And you're going to create this environment in which there are those who are going to be using Linux tools and going around telling people, "I use Linux," that aren't using Linux, really. They're using Windows, and they're using this Linux runtime, and that Linux runtime is allowing them to use Linux tools. It's the same thing with Chromebooks, because Chromebooks now run Linux applications. Of course, a Chromebook is Linux, but it's Google's Linux, and it is very locked down. And you have to keep in mind that when we're dealing with Google and Microsoft, these are companies that don't respect your privacy. They don't respect your freedom. Remember, all they want to do is make money. And one of the ways that a company like that can make money is gathering information and selling that information. And they engage in it all the time. And if you don't believe me, if you want to argue with me, please go read the EULA for Windows 10. The current EULA. It is on Microsoft's site. They make it perfectly plain that that computer is their property and they're allowing you to use it, and all of your personal data and any program that you install is the property of Microsoft, and they have the right to look at it, upload it, do whatever they want with it. And because you agree to it when you first start using Windows, or whoever installs it or sets it up, guess what? You can't legally say anything to them about it because you agreed to it. That's how it works, folks. I did a video about that years ago, and that video still gets a lot of views. Same thing with Google. Google wants you to use their products because then they can get information from you, and they can sell that to advertisers. To a certain extent, that doesn't bother me as long as that information is anonymous. But if you go by the law of 6 degrees of separation, it doesn't take much to put all the pieces together and figure out who an end user is. Now, I do have to say that I am a Google Chrome user. I use it all the time. I understand what Google does, and I'm okay with it for the time being. However, I am not a Windows user because I think Microsoft reaches too deep into the system, and they still maintain an open door in which they can change that system in any way. The best way to understand how Windows works is that you may be an administrator on that system. You may be the person who installed it and set it up. But they are a hyper user, okay? Which means that they can override whatever you do. With Unix and Linux, if you are the sole administrator on that machine, you must approve everything that changes that machine, that actually affects the system. You really are in control. Ubuntu, for instance, cannot change anything in your machine without you approving the change. In other words, installing the update or whatever. That doesn't mean that the canonical people couldn't go crazy one day and send down an update that you disagree with, but at least you have to approve it. You have to know what's happening. And there is a bit of a trust factor there. There is no trust factor with Microsoft. It doesn't exist. So, as we move forward in this reality, when the year of Linux on the Windows desktop is what they're calling it here in this article. I will put a link to the OMG Ubuntu article in this article in the description of the video if you want to learn more. We need to be aware of the consequences of Microsoft loving Linux. Now, there is a flip side to this, and if I wanted to be a Pollyanna and look at it just completely from an optimistic point of view, you could say that having this technology available on Windows will bring more people to Linux. Yes, that could be true. However, if you already had a system that served your needs, and you were not aware of the security or privacy or freedom aspects of Linux, only just the tools that you see, what would behoove you to drop that environment and move to an all Linux setup, like install Ubuntu or Manjaro or whatever? Why would you want to do that? Well, if you were just a really curious nerd, you'd probably do it anyway. But if you were like most computer users, you might not want to. I find that people who are not computer curious learn enough to get what they need to get done, and they have no desire to go beyond that. So could it be that our friends at Microsoft are counting on that? They've looked at the way Windows users react to things. They hate change. And they're saying, let us create an ecosystem that includes some of these open source goodies, but makes it So you absolutely have to use Windows to make that happen, or you have to go off and learn an entirely new system. Does that not sound like extend to you? Remember the old embrace, extend, extinguish? And the extinguish part would be if the Linux community itself didn't stand up and defend itself against the encroachment and make sure that we beat the drum for freedom and beat the drum for openness, and that we point out that an alternative exists, that you can download something that does not have the tentacles that Microsoft puts into Windows that wrap themselves around you and your personal data, and we don't have the vendor lock-in that you're going to get in commercial environments. We need to constantly be beating that drum and saying there is an alternative that doesn't involve you having to make a deal with the devil. And I think that, in and of itself, is the biggest challenge facing Linux in the next 5 years, is that as all of these corporations embrace it, will we be able to continue to keep our dignity and stick to the principles that make Linux a community and not a product? And that's a really important question that needs to be asked as we roll along. Developers develop because they think it's cool. They do not think of the consequences. I mean, how many science fiction movies do you have to see where some mad scientist creates some monster that takes over the world just because he thought it was cool and somebody ought to do it? Is that what's going on here? It's a good question, isn't it? And that is the reason why we are talking about it, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think the Windows subsystem for Linux is a way for new users to come to Linux, or do you think it is a way for Microsoft to extinguish Linux as we know it? Good questions. As usual, your feedback is always welcome. Check out EzeeLinux.com for more about Linux and join the discussion at EzeeTalk. And if you are a Facebook user, give EzeeLinux a like on Facebook. We have quite a vibrant community going on over there. Till we do this again, thanks for listening. See ya.